All right, hello and welcome to Real Talk Office Hours, hunting for silver linings for this Wednesday, June 10, 2020. Hosted today by myself, Corey Hart. We have George Katsanos and our special guest all the way from Gaza. We have Rafat, chapter director over there. And then we're brought to you by Startup Grind, the world's largest startup community. We have over 600 chapters in 125 plus countries. We operate with a mission to educate, inspire, and connect. And we're driven by three values. That's make friends, not contacts, help others before you help yourself, and give before you take. Now, the pandemic has been and will continue to be the great global leveler. As entrepreneurs, we do our very best for our businesses, our teams, our families, and we need to be informed, rational, analytical, and rigorous in our thinking. We should also learn to control our biases as they emerge in various circumstances. We invite you to join us live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday as we track the intersection of facts, biases, and action through our review of global financial markets alongside check-ins and real talk with Startup Grind chapter directors, entrepreneurs, and ecosystem stakeholders from around the world. No one has a crystal ball, but if we keep our eyes and ears open and pay attention, we may be able to see around the bend, and with some luck, spot the silver linings that are around every cloud. If you miss the live events, you can always view the recordings at startupgrind.com/grand-rapids, where you can also download the reading notes from the show. Now, before I introduce George for the global market update, a bit of housekeeping. Comments made and views expressed by all participants in this podcast are not intended to invite or incite individuals, entrepreneurs, or investors to buy or sell financial assets, real assets, commodities, futures, and or options. The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform, not to trade or to invest. If you feel compelled to trade and or invest, please call your broker. Now remember, risk is everywhere, even when you think that you're not taking a risk. Now, with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you George Katsanos to get us started on what the global markets are thinking today.
Corey, thank you. I would like to welcome Rafat Abushaban, our guest from Gaza today. Believe it or not, another day in the markets and another eventful week. As we suggested on Monday, this week is important because today at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, the Federal Reserve will announce its policy decision, and the chairman will take questions from the public. The press conference is always instructive, is always important for both what is said and what is not said. And as you can see from the front screen of today's Bloomberg, clearly more stimulus is definitely needed as the rebound starts. And this comes from the lips of the Secretary of Treasury. The currency market is telling us that we are beginning to embark on a slight weakening of the dollar against some of the major currencies. The reason for that is that the risk trade is on. The safe haven considerations of investors who invested into the dollar are abating. And we're beginning to see growth resume in most parts of the economies that are opening up. Whether, however, this opening up is consistent and does not require a second level of protection, i.e. a response of increasing lockdowns again, as a result of a second wave of coronavirus, is to be seen. However, what we have seen also on the bond markets, starting from Asia, we see essentially most of the markets being subdued, except South Korea that had a sudden jump. And the reason is obviously the fact that as the economy is beginning to perform, the inflation expectations seem to be increasing. Japan anchored at 0%. The 10-year bond is not moving at all. Australia, same as to what we've seen at the beginning of the week. As far as Europe is concerned, the weaklings, namely Italy, Spain, and Greece, are rallying. The bond markets are doing very well in these countries. Thank you. Germany is stuck at 0.3% negative. Switzerland is 0.4% negative. And that tells us that the markets are not convinced that growth is here to stay. But that is on the European side. So whatever you see happening on the euro-dollar exchange rate, please be aware that any strengthening of the euro could be temporary. Here in the United States, the 10-year bond is trading at less than 0.8%, Canada at 0.6%, Brazil at 7%, and Mexico at 6.1%. What these Latin American countries have in common is a history of defaults, a history of sovereign defaults. And despite the fact that the yields are high, the market is cautious. On the commodity front, I would like to emphasize here that according to reports, the Goldman Sachs traders made $1 billion in the last couple of months. These are commodity traders. The oil rally from -40 to +40 was phenomenal. Goldman Sachs printed a report on the commodity front yesterday, suggesting that the rally we've seen in commodities may be overstated. They are suggesting caution, and they're also suggesting that people take profits. Let's start with the energy sector. West Texas Intermediate is trading at under $39 a barrel, 38.80. Brent solidly over $41. The natural gas is at 1.8. Very little change over the last few weeks on natural gas. Gold, on the other hand, is at 17.20. Again, two considerations: safe haven against the debasement of global currencies and all inflationary expectations. If the market expects inflation to reemerge, then gold is a good investment. If the market is expecting volatility in the currencies, gold is a good investment. We tend to think that neither of the two is likely to be of significance. Despite what everyone is saying, we do not have inflationary pressures. The prices here in the US have been stable and weak, and the same in Europe, the same in Japan. We don't see major changes in the consumer price index, except copper. Copper has had an amazing rally. We are now seeing copper trading at $265 per pound. That is way, way higher, probably about $60 from the low that we saw it in the middle of the crisis in March. On the agricultural front, the corn, wheat, and soybeans have been trading sideways, despite the fact that we have record crops. The market seems to be discounting these positive news about the size of the crop, with expectations that we may have a dry second half of June and July. We will see how the forecast develops, but what we do see is that the environment, the weather conditions in Southern Europe, where we have many of these commodities grow, especially wheat, soybeans, and corn, are benign. Very little rain is expected over the next few days. So wrapping up the commodity front, we see that we have had a rally from the lows. Caution is warranted from now onwards. Let's go over to stocks. Well, believe it or not, we're having a mixed stock environment. And the reason we have a mixed stock environment is because we have Asia being, for the most part, on the red, except China. On the green, except China, which has been down. Many of the Asian economies were slightly up today on trading. The rally has continued. However, fears remain about China, especially China's growth, which has been subdued, and the monetary stimulus that the central bank is pursuing. As we mentioned on Monday, we anticipate that about 10% of China's GDP is going to be new stimulus money being printed by the central bank. Europe is very mixed, and the reason Europe is mixed is because we have reached a kind of big turning point. The relief rally based on the stimulus money seems to have come to a kind of slowdown. I think the market is waiting to hear what the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell is going to say today. And whatever he says, but also what he doesn't say, is going to be very important. Remember, and I will close with this comment, that the Federal Reserve is expecting the fiscal authorities to introduce an environment that will support the efforts of the Federal Reserve. So far, The Congress has passed one piece of legislation. It seems that Secretary Mnuchin is suggesting more is to come. We will find out. Back to you, Corey.
Thank you very much, George. It continues to be really incredible how central banks from all over the planet are all falling into line and doing some of these incredible measures. Some of these banks that have never ever employed these tricks before. I was talking to Rafat earlier before we hit record about how we talk, George, every now and then about how this pandemic is bringing us together more as a global community than ever before, even though, say, our economies might be retracting within our borders to some degree. So it's really neat to see everyone collaborating.
Corey,
Mhm.
to this point that you're mentioning, I think it is very important to emphasize the fact that we have built with real talk, we have built our understanding of what is happening at the grassroots. And what we're seeing is that, unlike what Nouriel Roubini mentioned about a month ago in one of his articles about deglobalization, we're seeing a new kind of globalization. It is more intelligent, is more meaningful, and it is about creating the villages that nurture the entrepreneurial ecosystem.
Exactly. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce to everyone Rafat. Hi, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, Corey, George, and Maria, and lovely to be here.
And I'd love to get a quick introduction on your personal background. And I know that you're involved in more communities than just the Startup Grind community. So we'll want to hear about that stuff too.
Yeah, thank you. So basically, I've been involved in the startup ecosystem, not only in Palestine, but also in the region and beyond for the last 8+ years, being speaker and a mentor for a number of startups and within a number of startup events. I'm the founder of a platform called Driable. Hopefully, we'll discuss that furthermore within this talk. It's basically a platform for entrepreneurs from emerging markets to get empowered and get the tools to start their journey to become entrepreneurs. Also, the advisor member, board council of South by Southwest 2018 all the way to 2020. And also the country coordinator for the British Chartered Computing Society. Also, I'm involved in a number of NGO projects helping youth and empowering youth and families and hopefully doing some economic empowerment for startups and entrepreneurs and beyond within the region and within the industry.
Sounds like you're busy.
Indeed.
Indeed. Could you tell us a little bit about your Startup Grind chapter and how you found Startup Grind?
Right. So it's actually an interesting story, but maybe before I'll get to that, I'll just it's good to understand the context that we're in. So I'll just give a very brief background on the Gaza Strip and Gaza City itself, and then go to the bigger picture. So basically, Gaza is a city within an area called the Gaza Strip. It's basically 365 square kilometers on the coast of the Mediterranean, at the point where like the countries, the continents of Asia and Africa meet. So historically, it has a significant presence, and over the past few years, it has been a hot center for a lot of actions and a lot of wars and issues, and it's usually turned up on the news as a hotspot for events to happen where like things that were unprecedented. But the thing is that despite the occupation and despite all of those news, Corey and I were just talking before this chat, there's a really a promising community of startups and entrepreneurs that are far exceeding their peers around the region. And given the right resources and set of tools that they can actually access the global market, which in most cases they're like unable to do so. Hopefully we'll expand on that a little bit later. they can actually create true success stories of the region. Having said that, startup incubators were a trigger to the startup community here in the Gaza Strip and in Palestine, starting in 2011, 2012, and then the startup movement started picking events. Palestinians were actually entrepreneurs for hundreds of years, but with a new concept of entrepreneurship and startups with like the tech side of startups, it has actually reignited the tech revolution since 2011, 2012, where a number of incubators popped across the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. A lot of entrepreneurs started to reform, and the university graduates started to come up with new ideas to solve community problems. And at that time, a lot of events were starting to take place, like Startup Weekend and boot camps. And a lot of international attention has started to build up. I recall being a member of several committees, welcoming a number of experts coming to the Gaza Strip to see at firsthand how startups are doing. And one of the mentors said, so how do you exchange experiences? We said, yeah, we do events and we do startup weekends. But they say, do you have like a platform to exchange what successful people have done and what the failed stories were, so that the community can benefit, something like Startup Grind? So I took that to heart, actually. That was back in 2015, digged it a little bit and got more involved with Startup Grind community. And we launched in September 2015 till today, where we are very active. And we have a strong community nearing 1,000 participants on the Startup Grind community page, and more than approaching 4,500 community members on other social media platforms. Until today, we are trying our best to do our message, that is providing free and easy use of resources to entrepreneurs in the region to help them realize how to build up their startups, avoid mistakes that were done by others, and also gain traction to the local startup ecosystem and raising the profile for the local startup ecosystem.
Well, I really do appreciate the greater context, and it does sound like the region is lucky to have you at the helm there, driving a lot of really great programming activity and access. Breaking down the barriers to access to just ideas in the first place. And then we can worry about capital and everything else, right?
Yes, exactly.
So you mentioned that there are elements of the ecosystem that are really thriving. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about that? Is that like an investment side? Is it the founder side, or different sectors?
Right. So basically talking about the ecosystem in Palestine in general, the ecosystem is more or less primitive, but it has its clear fronts and clear titles. So we do have a good number of accelerators and business incubators that are across the country, serving entrepreneurs. These offer basic startup training in leadership, entrepreneurship, financial issues, marketing issues, business issues, and all those topics that are important for the entrepreneurial toolkit. There's also a couple of small, let's say, venture capital funds based in the West Bank. They do active profiles in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Also, there's a number of other ecosystem feeders, including local universities. Local universities have and still are very active in the startup ecosystem, because I would claim more than 80% of the modern entrepreneurs are actually recent university graduates, because in the region here, the poverty rates and the unemployment rates for graduates are very high. They're like on the UN record levels. So entrepreneurs at starting 2011, 2012 was seen as a place where unemployment could be solved and people could actually find a job for themselves. not knowing exactly what's entrepreneurship involved and how this doesn't really solve this problem. A lot of youth and entrepreneurs were driven to the startup ecosystem, and that actually gave the ecosystem quite a good boost. That we had ideas in, I believe, all sectors. We had tech ideas, agricultural ideas, medical ideas, modern technology, AI ideas, and all these things. Despite the fact that the failure rates are very high because of the very fragile business environment. For example, let's say tech startups usually need a platform to get payments to and from, such as PayPal and Stripe. Palestine is not recognized neither in PayPal nor in Stripe. So entrepreneurs have to find other ways how to attract money from their customers. So sometimes you find very creative solutions around this problem, but given that problem, it's very limiting for their growth internationally and regionally. So that's just something right out of my mind to mention a case. So having said that, yes, there's a thriving ecosystem despite the barriers. Mostly the ecosystem is on two fronts. It's definitely serving the local market needs. There are different solutions to solve the payment issues and to solve the tech problems and to solve the other day-to-day problems for local customers. But given that the local customer base is not that huge and there's a great potential international customers, over the past, I think from 2015 or something like that, freelancing has become a major title. So it has grown from individuals doing freelance work to startups doing freelance activities to businesses. So the B2B environment is very big now. So there are a number of success stories. Sadly, because it's a B2B and white labeling environment, it's difficult always to credit the startup itself. It usually comes within the name of a bigger enterprise outside the Gaza Strip or outside Palestine. But that has definitely became now the hot market for everybody to dig into. And that was also affected by the COVID endemic recently over the past few months.
Right. Now you touched on something very important there, is the topic of infrastructure. Could you speak a bit about how that affects your ecosystem?
Right. The infrastructure is an interesting topic because it's in principle, we do have developed tools and machinery and equipment, most cases, to have a sustainable infrastructure. But the problem is that with the instability and with the occupation activities on the ground, usually this infrastructure is fragile. Usually these machineries that are outdated, they're not easily replaced, and they're the border control is very difficult. In startup grind, for example, we had I could count numerous cases where we had guests that couldn't actually come to the Gaza Strip to serve as guests on the startup grind because of the border control and issues. And we've actually started 2 or 3 years ago tinkering with virtual events due to that problem. But nevertheless, this infrastructure, although there are some workarounds, there are things that are difficult to work with. As I mentioned earlier, the payments problem is really a headache for the tech community as a whole, not only entrepreneurs. Other issues, including import and export of physical goods. So any startup that is working on hardware, on exporting and importing materials, is in a problem to get through that because they require numerous and costly permissions to do these kinds of agreements and to do these kinds of activities. That drives a lot of people to the tech side of the things. So software tech easily can be imported and exported virtually, and this has also achieved the uprising of the freelancing ecosystem and engage that with the startup ecosystem, as I have mentioned. Nevertheless, the infrastructure and the limitations of the infrastructure, I believe, are still one of the most biggest barriers that are in front of the community today. Just to say the least, like a few years back, entrepreneurs were trying to attend and participate in virtual and international events and competitions. They were like forbidden from movement through border control because of occupation, and they couldn't actually get out. So although we can speak easily virtually, it's difficult to not have the option of seeing other people face to face, especially if you're doing business with someone that you need to see face to face sometimes. So that's the barriers and the problems by the occupation are still the largest barriers, despite the fact that entrepreneurs are devising every day ways to work around these barriers.
Right. We were just speaking with Celestine from outside of Nairobi in Kenya just the other day, and she spoke about, she specifically works within EdTech, and how there was some really, really great pivots within Nairobi, but as soon as you get outside the city, then access to proper cell services and whatnot make things very challenging. Access to infrastructure and data. George, do you have any comments or questions for Rafat?
Yes, Rafat, thank you for this introduction and explanation. Indeed, infrastructure is something that we in the United States take for granted. If we go to a place and we don't get 100% strong signal, either in our Wi-Fi or on internet, we tend to complain. I can imagine how difficult it is for you to build an ecosystem when the rudimentary infrastructure is weak. Once you accept, however, that there is infrastructure issues, how strong do you see the angel investor community? I mean, again, we always know that the first investor in a new business is going to be your family and your friends. And beyond that, you have Series A, the first round, which is going to be some angel investors or a wider circle of friends that you may have. Does this work in a similar way in Gaza, or do you expect the diaspora to be more of a contributor to what you're doing?
Yeah, a very interesting question. Thanks for that. I'll answer on that, but just to touch back on the infrastructure problem, as you mentioned, taking things for granted is really a key word that you've mentioned. Like, just to say something that like I've been hearing from the entrepreneurs and the startup ecosystem and also normal people, during the COVID endemic recently, one of the main problems that many countries faced around the world, mainly in the US, is actually the inability of movement. Like airports are closed down, even you can't move from place to another. So in a case that's different when you have an expectation to have these things for granted, but people here are saying we're now on a level playing field because these new circumstances are our norm, like they're our everyday lives. That brings a new and interesting topic, that the endemic, although it has hit everybody hard, and nobody can deny it's difficult circumstances and difficult results. To say an example, here in the Gaza Strip, we up till today we didn't have like any formal quarantine whatsoever. We do have like protective measures, and we have like border control measures and these kinds of things. But within the city, there hasn't been any need for quarantine because we're already closed. The borders are mostly closed, so very people come in and out. So the only control was on the people who come in and out. Other than that, it's business as usual. So it's difficult, it's interesting, sorry, to see how the world in the new light is accepting this new norm that is our reality. And a lot of startups have actually benefited from that from a business perspective, because their operations are still normal. They haven't changed. They have been used to this border restriction and movement restrictions for years now. So now they're more than able to work from home, more than able to work from their desks, and they can even move as they used to do. So that has actually brought many entrepreneurs and startups more profitable over the past few months because of these new norms. Of course, other more traditional brick and mortar companies and businesses, which are like limited here, but they exist, also were affected badly because of the the movement restrictions and import and export of goods. So you could find some selective goods not available in the market and so on and so forth. So definitely there's both ways to the infrastructure thing, but it has been very interesting to see how this pivot and shift happens. And now regarding the angel investors and the investment community, as I mentioned, there are investment venture capital funds in the West Bank. Due to instability regions, these investment funds do invest in the Gaza Strip startups, and they have invested in numerous startups in hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 3 years. There isn't a venture capital fund based in Gaza because of hence mentioned, but there are a lot of angel investors active on the ground. Because of that, I would say, fragile situation, we don't have a formal body of angel investments in the ground, but a lot of entrepreneurs were actually approached by private business owners and existing businesses to join efforts through these times. So a lot of more traditional brick and mortar businesses were actually approaching startups and entrepreneurs to have them join up at certain activities to modernize their way of doing things, because they realize they have to do this now or they'll go out of business. So these kinds of you would say, informal angel investments were going all around us, and they were happening on the ground, despite not having formal records of that. The sectors these include are like mostly based in the local market, like you would say traditional brick and mortar, like food chains, sales stores, small and large groceries, clothes stores, and textiles, and many of the local businesses that serve the local market. It's a little bit different for the international market, because, as I've mentioned, the freelancing and outsourcing is more of the norm here. The tech side is the king in this area. But locally, there has been like quite a few some successes here and there that were worthy to mention.
Thank you. That's a very, very detailed answer. I think the digitalization process, as it is evolving around the world, is actually an interesting stimulus for traditional brick and mortar businesses to migrate and therefore become angel investors in their own right. I mean, this model, we've seen it time and again, and it is probably a model that will support the ecosystem further down the road, right?
Definitely. And if something that we can get out of this endemic is that we need to be flexible, we need to be easy to pivot and switch, and we need also to always have that plan B scenario, because businesses that used to adopt the mentality of business as usual isn't really business as usual. Business as usual is a recipe for disaster. The disruption of businesses and being able to directly react to the circumstances and disasters is what really proved the flexible from the non-flexible businesses throughout this endemic.
One of the last questions that I would like to ask you on our side here, we have seen that the big private equity houses, the Texas Pacific groups of this world, and so on and so forth, suffered from FOMO, the fear of missing out. After the first 4 or 5 weeks of the pandemic hitting their investee companies, they started rushing out to find new opportunities and so on and so forth. Corey and I have discussed with a number of acquaintances, but also members in the community, that we don't know what the next normal is going to look like. What, in your perspective, from your perspective in Gaza, do you see as the next normal, whether it is 3 months, 6 months, a year, that your community is seeing, is noticing?
An interesting question and a difficult one too. Given the facts on the ground, and as I mentioned, things didn't really change within the Gaza Strip as they have changed outside it because of border control and so on and so forth. the main changing factor will be how the world has changed, because a lot of countries weren't like hit as bad as other countries, but the problem is that everybody was hit with this endemic. So since everybody was affected by it, the norm of doing business is going to affect everybody, regardless of them directly being affected or not. That brings us to this reality, is that we were talking in a discussion last week that we more or less have now a level playing field in some sectors, in educational sector, in some tech sectors. So especially in sectors that are like dependent on the expertise and talents of the individuals themselves and their skills, and don't really require that much investment in infrastructure and goods and equipment. These sectors are actually very, I would say definitely they're like a blue ocean for entrepreneurs now, and some entrepreneurs are actually trying to notice them now and to target them. The freelance movement over the past few years was triggered by maybe relatively lower prices with a good quality of design and production that was provided by developers and designers here to attract regional attention to it. But with everything going on, this might have opened a little bit more for the entrepreneurs who are actually trying to get to more international audiences. And once they're like one success stories, everybody wants to copy it. So that's something very unique to this circumstance, because a lot of success stories, that small success stories, I would say, maybe they're not even worthy to mention, but because they were successes, other entrepreneurs were trying to copy them and move on to attract new targets and new markets, having the competitive advantage of saying, we haven't changed business as usual. Your business with us, because it's for us, it's business as usual. Nothing has changed. So if you're like doing through difficult times, we can help you, because we're still operating, because this is the norm for us. We usually work under pressure and under disasters well. So that's something to mention. Other than that, definitely the digital world is going to have a more target market share from now on. Like, for example, in the platform that I've mentioned, Riable.com, that we have for entrepreneurs, we had 30% increase of our audiences just in 1 month when the endemic started. That was, I believe, in February, when it started reaching around the world. People are just, because we offer online courses and free materials for everybody to educate themselves and start their businesses. So we were like going slowly but surely, but in 1 month we had a sudden 30% for the overall database that we have increased, because people are actually now trying to get free resources, and that's a good thing. I believe it's also the age of open source software and freemium and free services that are like not based on the traditional old models, but based on the value they offer for customers and listeners and receivers, and then having maybe monetized the premium services of that as well. So even in Startup Grind, as Corey has mentioned, now they're doing a virtual event for everybody to see, and they're uploaded everywhere. So not just Startup Grind, everybody is doing this. Like, free resources are offered everywhere now because everybody is going online. And for people who want like more extensive services, this is a very good market opportunity that can get quite a return for entrepreneurs. So definitely a lot of opportunities, but they need entrepreneurs, I believe, my advice for anybody listening and interested to take on this new opportunities, to be fast and expecting of any changes in the market, because things are changing fast and a lot of bigger enterprises are getting into the game. So the person or the entrepreneurs who reaches first will be the winner of this new, maybe let's say digitalization 2.0 or something like that.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want to say anything more about Riable?
I mean, in general, as I've mentioned, we've noticed quite an interesting increase. We have audiences from the whole MENA region, from a lot of European countries and American countries as well, Canada and the US and also Southern American countries. Basically, what we offer is free online resources that we found people interested to get into, and that has extended our working hours and input to the people, and actually prove once and for all is that the entrepreneurs and the startups who will win this race are those who have something prepared beforehand that's ready to go to the next phase. So since we had this platform already, we managed to benefit from it and to extend it. So definitely, if any entrepreneurs have, they have something laying around, it's not really active, it's now is the time to, refresh it and give it a new blood in it, so that they can benefit from these amazing times that are difficult but full of opportunities.
That's really remarkable work. Congratulations on that and the success. One point that you brought up that George and I talk about a lot with folks is the importance of creating value. There's no room anymore for mediocrity. Especially when the globe has identified that 80% of the economy is not essential. It's just extra. We have to differentiate ourselves and make our pie the best pie out there. Couple last questions since we're running up against time. What can the international startup grind community do for you?
What is doing already for us is that one of the main problems, as I mentioned in the starting of this talk, is maybe the stereotyping. The stereotyping is that, okay, these areas, people are living in poverty, conflict, and problems. I mean, yes, that exists, but also a lot of opportunity and potential is there. So this is really a high risk, high gain opportunity. So what everybody is doing now, including us in Startup Grind Gaza, is that we're trying to highlight the ecosystem, and we're trying to highlight the challenges that we're going into, to also to highlight the benefits from working with this ecosystem. As I've mentioned, maybe sometimes entrepreneurs here are ready to work on lower costs than their peers in other areas, or maybe a challenge in the quality. So first and foremost, what we need is actually the highlighting of the ecosystem and saying we do have a flourishing ecosystem. We do have success stories. So the showcasing is very important to us. And thank you for the interview, for trying for me to do that as well, highlighting the ecosystem. Other than that is actually getting people interested to learn more, because you wouldn't ask any investor to come to an area that he or she doesn't know anything about. So after this awareness is a little bit to a level that can be business in a business sense acceptable for entrepreneurs to investors to think about, maybe more angel investors from the region and beyond the region and from the Palestinian diaspora could be more interested to have funds and invest in startups. This will create a great boost in the ecosystem, and hopefully in the near future we could see amazing results.
Sure. Yes. That all makes a great deal of sense. One of the last things we ask people, and then I'll let George at you again, is since you have such a heritage and some history there in the region, helping your community out, you're probably the first person a lot of people call when the ground breaks open and and the sky is on fire with the pandemic. What are some of the pieces of advice that you found yourself giving more often than not, or any unique problems that people have had that you've had to help them address?
Yeah, definitely. Maybe one of maybe a couple of points to close with. First thing, and that was actually the background because of which Riable was founded. Every region and every place has its own context and its own market and its own mentality. So it's different to copy an ecosystem, or different to copy a successful startup in an area or a region and put it in another region. And what we've found is that a lot of experienced mentors and business leaders actually are guilty of is that actually trying to go through the traditional business, standard business terms and business mentality and even entrepreneurship mentality in its traditional terms to entrepreneurs around the globe. And what we found that a lot of advice that is maybe relevant in somewhere in Europe is not really applicable to Africa, and what's applicable to Africa and not really applicable to Asia, and so on and so forth. So first and foremost is that a lot of entrepreneurs find difficulties in adopting the same mentality, maybe that they're like peers in Canada or the US are adopting. So we're actually trying to tell them, no, consider your context. Don't consider the standard context that other places that this might work. Consider what's good for your business and your market. Because of that, we've found Rival. Rival is basically a place that we don't give the standard entrepreneurship talk that, yeah, we have these three success stories, I don't know, Apple and Microsoft and IBM. No, we give local context stories, because these local context stories have gone through the same barriers that these entrepreneurs have gone through, and they're like more susceptible to help them overcome these barriers. The other thing is that always the problem with the entrepreneurs is in the region here mostly is marketing. Marketing is a double-edged sword, because hence I mentioned the border restrictions, so it's not always easy to get through to international audiences, not being able to face-to-face seeing them and dealing with them. The other thing is that the market itself is very changing in a rapid pace, and having the right set of mentality and tools and equipment and skills are very essential for entrepreneurs to actually get to the market. So marketing also is something that is not set in stone, that entrepreneurs in every startup, they need to learn themselves and to develop a strategy that's suitable for them. Not adopting other strategies that have worked for others is also something that's very common among startups that happens now and then. These are the main two questions or 2 points that can be actionable by entrepreneurs. There are other questions that we can't really solve regarding the infrastructure, regarding the access to finance, and regarding the overall situation of the ecosystem that is difficult on everybody. So it's just workarounds. There's no solution for that. But until this has a solution for everybody, it's good to do what we can with what we have. So this is the mentality that we try to always to give to the entrepreneurs.
Thank you for that insight. Then it's been really powerful to hear how those pieces of advice and the questions change from region to region. George, any last questions or thoughts for Rafat?
Where do you expect a successful exit? In which sector? And how do you envisage an exit of the local investors?
Right. The exits here are a little bit unique, because we do have like multiple forms of exits. They're like this standard traditional exit that a startup is accelerated or incubated at a startup incubator, and there will be a venture capital that invests in it, and then they will buy it, and then the startup will launch. Sadly, I mean, this has happened multiple times, but sadly, they weren't like highlighted stories, because, as I've mentioned, most of these startups were focusing on international markets without having the local context in place. So they're like trying to do business for somebody who's not living in the same or not dealing with the same infrastructure they already have. So there was a difference in the mentality of the business itself and the market that they were serving. So yeah, that's one type of exit. The more successful exit, and the more traditional one as well, was the more business to business exits. Like as I've mentioned, like a lot of entrepreneurs have kicked off their there was a story of an entrepreneur who did like deliveries the first time in the Gaza Strip. That was in 2011. They used to do like from shops to consumers on a very limited selection of goods and services. And because they were like very successful, they were like bought by a bigger chain, and they were like just spinned off later on to become one of the biggest delivery businesses here in the Gaza Strip. So it's interesting to see how these traditional exits from business people who are actually on the ground, these work because they have like the context and the market on the ground is available. Until the global market is a little bit more open and the markets are open more for the not only for providing support and providing good relief packages for the poor people, which is great, but also open for helping businesses grow and benefiting from the value that they offer. The international more wider scale can also be can be in place, like exits of acquisition from other places outside Palestine. We also do have like quite some successful stories in the West Bank as well, but nevertheless, I wouldn't say this is the norm because of the overall fragile situation. It's difficult to find like multiple success stories on multi-million-dollar scales, but I believe that we're reaching there very fast, hopefully, despite the difficulties that we're going through.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
George, any last thoughts before we get Rafat back to his evening?
No, I just want to repeat to Rafat, as we mentioned to all our interlocutors and participants, our resources here are available for you to use. You can call us. We have expertise across a whole range of issues and topics, and we're a click away. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Yeah, so with that, again, so gracious for the generosity of your time, and we'll still hang out after I stop recording for a second to chat. But yeah, thanks so much for joining us. This insight is powerful and very important. And so for those of you listening, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we record new episodes, checking in with stakeholders from ecosystems around the world, and we'll see you in the next Real Talk.